All right, good afternoon or good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
All right, I know we're all so enthused to stay, but I'm wrapping up the epistle, the letter of James. This is the final chapter we're getting ready to jump into from where we are. James, 4 chapters of conduct is going to be in the church, but this chapter is not necessarily conducting of people in church, but in the community. So we'll see how James is going to show us that we just don't need something that walks, but we also need to look out for those that are working as well in the community. So my topic and subject is going to be talking about when God gets furious with the wealthy. So we'll be looking at James chapter 5 and verse 1. And we'll read all the way to the 6th verse. I take it by silence, everyone has it. So I will continue on. Okay, so I'll be reading from the New King James Version. And it reads, "Come now, you rich, weep, howl for your miseries that are coming upon you." Verse 2, "Your riches are corrupted, and your garments are moth-eaten." Verse 3, "Your gold and silver are corroded, and their corrosions will be a witness against you and will eat your flesh like fire. You have heaped up treasure in the last days." Verse 4, "Indeed the wages of the laborers who moved your fields, which you kept back by fraud, cry out, and the cries of the reapers have reached the ears of the Lord of Sabaoth. You have lived on the earth in pleasure and luxury. You have fattened your hearts as in a day of slaughter. You have condemned, and you have murdered the just. He does not resist you." So, in comparison to many people in the world, we are truly blessed. In fact, assessment with most people who live now and those who lived in the past, we actually live in a very rich society. Now, it's imperative to stress that God does not condemn the rich for being rich, because some of the godliest people in the Bible, they were rich, such as Job, Abraham, Joseph, David, Solomon, Barnabas, Philemon, and Lydia. Conversely, Christ does speak of the struggle of the rich being saved, where Jesus speaks of this trouble in the Gospel according to St. Matthew, chapter 19, verse 23 and 26. Where he says, "Then said Jesus unto his disciples, Verily I say unto you, that a rich man shall hardly enter into the kingdom of heaven. And again I say unto you, it is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter into the kingdom." When his disciples heard it, they were exceedingly amazed, saying, "Who then can be saved?" But Jesus beheld them and said unto them, "With men this is impossible, but with God all things are possible." So now there are times when God is very angry at the rich, such as what we read in James chapter 5, verse 6. So let's study this passage more vigilantly, and we shall do by vexing in the 4 questions that I pose to you today. The first question is, who is James speaking to in this passage? The second question is, what is in store for these rich people? The third question is, why is God so livid with them? And fourthly and finally, what applications can we draw from this passage? Firstly, let's begin with this first question. Who is James speaking to in this passage? Are these Christians that he's referring to? Are these rich Christians who have been responsible for persecuting the brethren? Possibly, but unlikely, for several reasons. They are not addressed as brethren as it is often done in the epistles such as James 1 and 2, James 1 and 19, and James 2 and 1. There is no request for repentance in this passage, as there is throughout this epistle in those passages in which it is clear that the brethren are being addressed. And secondly, here in this text that we just read, there is only condemnation. So the brethren are not spoken until verse number 7, in which they are told to be patient in light of what has just been said. According to Dr. Peter Davids in the New International Greek Commentary, more likely those addressed are rich unbelievers, who had been oppressing the brethren, according to James chapter 2, verse 6. This rant of judgment upon them seems to serve the purpose of comforting the brethren who were being oppressed by them when we get to James 5 and 7. And James 5 and 4 says, "The Lord has heard their cries." Adjudication is coming upon these plush oppressors. So consequently, the Christians are told, be patient, which echoes from what James chapter 1 tells us to do. So we know who James is speaking to. The second thing, what is in store for those who are rich? Well, miseries that will trigger them to weep and howl. Verse 1 through verse 3 of chapter 5 says that these are definite misfortunes to come that James declares of them already happening. He says, your riches are corrupted. The garments are moth-eaten. The gold and silver are corrupted. When this corrosion of their riches occurs, it will operate as an observer against them that were guilty of the things that will be revealed shortly. It will eat their flesh, James says, like fire. So the agony and torture of poverty usually affects the hardest those who are once loaded. So the ones who feel the biggest effect of poverty are those that usually are the ones that are more well off. Thus, when scarcity strikes, it makes them weep and howl as though they were on fire. The misery spoken here may have reference to what later occurs in the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. According to Dr. James B. Adamson, says in his commentary, not long after this epistle was written, Jerusalem will be destroyed by the Romans. So much of the rich Jews had been subjugated to Christian brethren. Literally, they wept and they howled. What they had failed to realize was the heat of treasures in the last days. Comparable to the man in the parable of the rich fool taken out of the Gospel of St. Luke, chapter 12, verse 16 and verse 21, where it reads, "And he told them a parable, saying, the land of a rich man was very productive. And he began reasoning to himself, saying, what shall I do since I have no place to store my crops?" Verse 18, "Then he said, this is what I will do. I will tear down my barns. I will build larger ones. And there I will store all my grains and my goods. And I will say to my soul, soul, you have many goods laid up for many years to come. Take your ease, eat, drink, and be merry. But what have you prepared? So is the man who stores up treasures for himself and is not rich towards God." They thought they were laying up riches for their latter days, but in fact, it was the last days of the Jewish economy when they were so busy storing up wealth. Like some today who store up retirement and then they die before they retire. Here we see God is angry at these rich people. Why is God so angry? Well, firstly, because of how they got their wealth. James chapter 5 verse 4 says, "Behold, they paid of the laborers who mowed your fields, and which has been withheld by you, cries out against you. And the outcry of those who did the harvesting has reached the ears of the Lord," explicitly by refusing wages from those who had worked for them. So it was not just how they got their wealth, but how they used their wealth. They hoarded their wealth. Chapter 5 verse 3 says, they dispersed it on themselves with indulgences. And here in verse 5 it says, you have lived luxuriously on the earth and led a life of wanted pleasure. You have fattened your hearts in the days of slaughter. In other words, they were fattening themselves like cows for slaughter. They used that authority that comes with prosperity not to liberate, but to oppress those that were doing right. Because James 5 and 6 says, you have condemned and put to death those that are righteous. This is possibly a reference to Christ being the righteous man, or the Christian whom they also oppressed. The manner in which they got their wealth and used it caused those who were oppressed to cry out, and the Lord heard their prayers. Now when we read the fields and cries out against you is also used in the judgment of Cain when he murdered his brother Abel. So what we see here is James is reaching back to what happened in Genesis. The same terminology of crying out is the same way we see the fields and cries out against you is also used with the judgment of Cain, where the blood cried out against him. Now God, who is just, is about to bring sentence upon these rich oppressors. So let's just take a parenthetical pause right here to say, God doesn't just care so much about how you conduct yourselves in church, but he also cares about how you compensate those in your community. So God is not just judging you on whether you're being kind or whether you're being helpful, but also, are you doing right by your fellow man? So what applications can we take away? I'm glad you asked. Let me say this. We need to be careful how we obtain our wealth. To do so at the cost of others will bring God's rage upon us. It is in Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 14 and 15 that says this: "You shall not oppress a hired servant who is poor and needy, whether he is one of your countrymen or one of your aliens who is in your land, in your own town." It is wicked to think that accomplishments can only come by walking on others. This might be fitting to add in 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 9 and 10. Paul says, "But those who want to get rich fall into temptation and a snare, and many foolish and harmful desires will plunge men into ruin and destruction." Verse 10 is the infamous scripture that probably all of us know. "For the love of money is a root of all sorts of evil, and some by longing for it have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many griefs." It is not wealth that is wrong, but the aspirations to be wealthy that is operated with menace. Wealth is not wicked if it by the byproduct of our endeavors and not the goal. Someone may want to be a doctor. Someone in here may just want to be a plumber. Based upon your skills or ability, the interest in such matters, and receive riches as a byproduct because of the worth society might place on such services. But to enter such professions solely because one's goal is to get rich thereby, then we are ensnared by the love of money. So then, how do we attain our wealth? If we do it truthfully and in payment for a job well done, God will not be displeased. But if we do it by hurting others and by making wealth our primary object, then we are in danger of God's wrath. We need to be careful how we use our wealth, because to spend it on luxurious living when others are suffering is just as wrong. This is exactly what James has described in this passage. It is an indication of the lack of love for God. For 1 John chapter 3:17 says, "But whoever has the world's goods and sees his brothers in need and closes his heart against him, how does the love of God dwell in him?" According to the New Testament, the purpose of working is not to obtain wealth for our own gratification, but to help those who are less fortunate. As commanded by Paul in Ephesians chapter 4, verse 28, he says, "He who steals must steal no longer, but rather he must labor, performing with his own hands what is good, so that he will have something to share with one who has needs," as demonstrated by Paul in Acts chapter 20, verse 24 and 25. "You yourselves know that these hands minister my own needs and to the men who were with me. In everything I showed you that by working hard in this manner, you must help the weak and remember the words of the Lord Jesus, that he himself said, 'It is more blessed to give than to receive.'" I conclude with this thought, friends. We live in a country and a society in which we have much for which to be thankful for. But we also have an abundance of which we need to be careful. We are existing in a society where it's quite easy to become wealthy. We're in a society where covetousness or the desire to be rich are not considered sins. We live in a society where heaping up treasures for our own gratification is considered an inalienable right. It is easy to be influenced by these values, but perhaps we should ask ourselves regularly this question: are we laying up treasures in heaven or on earth? According to the Gospel of St. Matthew, chapter 19 and 21, Jesus said, "If you wish to complete, go, sell your possessions, and give to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven. Come and follow me." Paul admonishes us in 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 18, "Instruct them to do good, be rich in good works, to be generous and ready to share, storing up for themselves the treasure of a good foundation for the future, so that they may take hold of that which life is indeed." So those who lay up treasures in heaven are those who practice their wealth to do morally right and assist the poor and less fortunate. Those who lay up treasures on earth are actually storing up for themselves misery and madness. Miseries when their wealth fails them in their time of true need, and madness from God in the day of wrath that is yet to come. God bless you.
Pastor G.